Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my talk about HTTP request smuggling in 2020. My name is Amit Klein. You can read more about me in this slide. And today we're going to talk about HTTP request smuggling, which is an attack that involves three actors. One is the attacker, who is practically a client. The other one is a proxy or a firewall. And the third actor is a web server, or it can be a chain of proxies and firewalls leading finally to a web server. And the attack involves the attacker connecting over port 80 of TCP to the proxy and sending the proxy an HTTP stream consisting of three chunks or three parts: A followed by B followed by C, and we designate the A part in red, the B part in green, and the C part in blue. The proxy interprets this stream as the first request being A followed by B, and the second request as C, and it forwards those two requests to the web server. And the web server, however, interprets those two requests as the stream, as a first request A followed by a second request B and C. And thus it responds with the responses for A and for BC. And the proxy then caches for AB the response that the web server provided for A. And more importantly, the proxy caches for C the response that the web server generated for the data, for the messages BC. And that latter part is exactly where HTTP request smuggling takes effect and ends up in web cache poisoning in this example. The HTTP request smuggling attack is also called the HTTP Desyncing attack per James Cattle's recent research. Just to illustrate this in more detail, this is an example string where the red part is the first chunk that the proxy receives. In green, we see the second chunk, and in blue, we see the third chunk. And let's say that the proxy interprets or uses the last content length header. In such case, the proxy will interpret this stream as two HTTP requests, one with 44 bytes body, consisting of the red part followed by the green part, and the second one is the blue part, which is an entirely new HTTP request. So from the proxy's perspective, the proxy will see the first request for hello PHP and the second request for target HTML. Whereas, say, we have a web server that interprets or that uses the first content length header. In such case, we'll see the first request being the red part, which is a request with 0 body length, followed by another request, the green and the blue parts. So from the web server's perspective, the first request will be to hello PHP with 0 bytes in the body, and the second request will be for the poison HTML resource with some extra headers in blue. And as you can see, the proxy will therefore cache for the target HTML URL the data that the web server provided for the poison HTML URL, and thereby we achieve a web cache poisoning. A short history of HTTP request smuggling. As we can see, in 2005, that's a decade and a half ago, the seminal paper HTTP request smuggling was published. It was followed by several research small papers. And then for almost a decade, there was no substantial research in HTTP request smuggling, in the HTTP request smuggling area. There were, of course, vulnerabilities published, but no significant research as far as I know. In 2015, 2016, Regis Leroy published his Hiding Rookies in HTTP, reviving the interest in this area. And in 2019, James Cattle published his series of papers around HTTP desync attacks in Black Hat USA and in Black Hat Europe. So given all this, my question is HTTP request smuggling still a thing? This is 2020, and we are, after all, aware of the attack for over a decade and a half. It was back to the limelight in recent years, thanks to James Kettle and Regis Leroy. And our mainstream web and proxy servers are still vulnerable. The scope of my research is the usual suspects, and you'd expect them to be all immune by now. But since I'm here in Black Hat, the answer is no. Let's see some interesting variants. First is a header followed by space or carriage return, followed by some junk. For example, content length header, followed by the content length, followed by space, followed by ABCD with a value of 20. And as it happens, Squid ignores this header completely, but it forwards it as is. Whereas Abyss X1 web server converts it into just the header part without the space or the junk. So web cache poisoning attack with Squid in front of Abyss may be constructed as following. We have the legitimate content length header with 41 bytes, and followed by this not so legit content length header with space and junk with the value of 3. Squid uses the valid content length header and ignores the invalid header. So from Squid's perspective, we're talking about a body length of 41 bytes, whereas Abyss uses the second content length header, which has the value of 3 from Abyss's point of view. So Abyss will see the second request for poison HTML and serve it, whereas Squid will see the second request as get welcome HTML, so it will cache the content of the poison URL served by Abyss to the URL welcome HTML. Now, what if we don't like this to feed the Abyss with 2 content length headers? What if we suspect that Abyss will fix this soon? So we discovered an interesting Abyss behavior, something that is also exhibited by other web servers, which is if the request is partial, it may still be fulfilled by the web server. And by partial, I mean that the full body bytes were not yet received. So Abyss in such case will wait 30 seconds, and then it will invoke the backend script and provide the proxy or the client with the data that this script generated. And after additional bytes are received in the TCP connection, they will be silently discarded until the full body is read. And then Abyss will start parsing the next request. So what would an attack look like? In this case, we have just the connection, the invalid content length header, in which case Squid will interpret this as a zero-length body request and will only send the headers to Abyss. Abyss will wait Abyss expects 39 bytes in the body. It waits for 30 seconds, then invokes hello PHP. Hello PHP generates some answer. This is forwarded to Squid, and then Squid sends the next request that from its point of view, this is get, welcome, and so forth. And then Abyss will silently discard the 39 bytes that belong to the first request from its perspective and start serving the second request, which is get poison HTML. So again, web cache poisoning. Some interesting variants I discovered relate to how ModSecurity plus CRS behave, specifically this community rule set. ModSecurity plus CRS is actually a free and open source web application firewall. It provides some rudimentary direct protection against HTTP request smuggling. It has paranoia levels. It runs by default in paranoia level 1. And it has some more strict rules in paranoia level 3 or 4, but these generate a lot of false positives, so they practically cannot be used in production environments. And our bypass works for paranoia levels 1 and 2. So let's look at it. Let's review what the challenges were and how we overcame them. So the problem with ModSecurity plus CRS is that our HTTP request smuggling payloads got blocked by the HTTP response splitting attack rules. So for example, we have two rules, 921.130 that looks for a pattern of HTTP/0910 or 11. And we have another one that looks for carriage return and line feed in argument names. Both are geared towards blocking HTTP response splitting. Unfortunately, for us, they also work against our HTTP request smuggling payloads. Walking around the last one, the 150, is trivial. We just move the attack from what ModSecurity considers as the argument name to the argument value by prepending an argument, bogus or fake argument name, xy equals something, and then we move away from being an argument name. As for the 130, the trick is to use HTTP 1.2 instead of HTTP 1.0 or 1.1. And as it happens, IIS, Apache, Nginx, Node.js, and Abyss respect HTTP 1.2, and they treat it as HTTP 1.1. And in their proxy heads, Squid, HA Proxy, Caddy, and Traffic respect HTTP 1.2, but converts them into HTTP 1.1. There's still a small problem with rule 150, which is triggered because the payload contains something that looks like a Unix direct command execution, the space followed by slash, but that can be worked around too by using the full proxy URL, as you can see below. And then we discovered a much more funny bypass, which is to use content length text plain. This one in paranoia levels 1 or 2 simply makes the content rule set, community rule set to disregard the body entirely, and so we can get our HTTP request smuggling attack nicely through ModSecurity plus CRS. And the fifth variant is actually documented somewhere in Burp's HTTP request smuggling module as a 0D wrap, but I don't think I've seen any successful use of that until today. So we discovered that Squid ignores a header prepended by a carriage return. It just forwards it as is, and Abyss respects this header. And here's an example of an HTTP request smuggling attack ending in web cache poisoning using the wait for it trick again. So we just feed this invalid content length header, Squid ignores it, and Abyss respects it. One last tip for overriding existing cache items. So sometimes a page is cached and you want to poison it. You can use a cache control no cache for the request that involves this page, and the header may be moved around, so you need to be careful about it when you calculate payload lengths and offsets. Let's see those variants in action. We can start with the Abyss web server version. As you can see, it's pretty recent, followed by the Squid version, which you can see it's fully patched at the time of testing. And then let's see now variant 1. We first load the target page, the original target page, which makes it also which makes Squid cache it. And then we run the smuggling script to see our options. We use now the first variant. And now we load the same target page in a different browser to avoid the browser caching issues. And we see indeed that it is poisoned. Moving to the second variant, again, we load the URL. We see that the page is cached correctly. Now, We run the second variant. The time fast forwards for 30 seconds. And we check the page again from a different browser instance, and we see that it's poisoned. Finally, we run the fifth variant. Again, we load the target URL. Now it's cached in Squid. We run the fifth variant. Time is fast forwarding 30 seconds. And we load this URL again through the proxy, and we see that it is cached, it is poisoned. So I reported all those variants to Squid and Abyss and OWASP community rule set. It was fixed in Abyss and in OWASP community rule set, and hopefully by the time this presentation is screened, Squid will also fix those issues in its product. And after seeing that the issue is still real, I started considering what the possible solutions may be. First, I want to discuss some flawed approaches for protection against HTTP request smuggling. For example, some people claim that normalization of outbound HTTP headers for proxy servers is a solution. And I think that obviously it's a solution for the HTTP devices behind the proxy, but it's completely ineffective for all attacks that take place between the proxy and the devices in front of it. So for example, if you are a client and there is a proxy P1, and then you are proxy P2 in this chain, and finally there's a web server, then and P1 uses, say, the first content length header, and P2 uses the last content length header, then you can mount an HTTP request smuggling between P1 and P2. Now, if you ask whether this is whether P2 is to be blamed or to shoulder part of the blame, think of the P2 to the web server connection as an abstraction for web server WS prime. So now the client is communicating through a single proxy P1 to web server WS prime, and WS prime accepts multiple content length headers and uses the last one. Now, would you say in this case that WS prime is vulnerable to HTTP request smuggling? Because if you say yes, then obviously P2 is vulnerable to HTTP request smuggling, because WS, the original WS, can be fully 100% RFC compliant, and yet HTTP request smuggling and web cache poisoning can take place. So if you accept the premise that in such case a web server is vulnerable to HTTP request smuggling, then obviously a proxy is too. Same argument applies to having a TCP connection per each outbound request. Again, something that proxy servers can do. It's good for HTTP devices behind the proxy, but it's not effective for HTTP devices in front of the proxy. So moving back to finding a solution. So my first stop was obviously with ModSecurity plus the CRS. It has some obvious pros, like being a true web application firewall, being free and being open source. But it also has some serious cons, which is it only supports a small subset of web servers, and it only has a rudimentary defense against HTTP request smuggling. So from my perspective, it's not good enough. So I started thinking about what an ideal solution would look like. And my concept is something lightweight and simple and easy, not a fully fledged WAF. It should focus on specific protocol attacks like HTTP request smuggling and maybe additional attacks. It should be secure, obviously. And I want to develop a proof of concept that doesn't need to be production quality. It just needs to demonstrate a concept that then vendors can take and implement in their products, or third-party security providers can implement as a production-grade solution. And more specifically, the architecture would be, or the solution would revolve around having a very strict validation of small subset of the HTTP standards. So I'm talking about anything that can affect the request length, specifically the content length header and the transfer encoding header, and having unambiguous line ends and header block end. And of course, monitoring the request line for verb names should be unambiguous, because the verb name sometimes dictates that the request mustn't have a body, or typically doesn't have a body. And unambiguous protocol designation in order to avoid the HTTP 09 syndrome, and maybe other headers that I haven't thought about yet. I want my solution to be generic, so it doesn't tie to specific technology or product or platform. So specifically, I don't want to rely on Windows LSP or WFP. And it would be nice to have that it can be extended beyond HTTP, like having decrypted HTTPS traffic and maybe other protocols. And of course, it should be secure. So I think that the only way to do that is with in-path monitoring and not something based on sniffing. And architecturally, the solution I arrived to is the good old function hooking for, in this case, for the socket layer functions. So a few words about function hooking. While completely non-standard, it's de facto used very commonly in major operating systems like Windows and Linux. And there are even cross-platform function hooking libraries like FunkHook that I use in my project. Stability and robustness may be an issue, but again, this is a proof of concept library. It's not a full product. And hooking is just one piece of the game. One needs still to inject the code, or at least an initial code. In Windows, this can be done by using a standard DLL injection. In Linux, you can use LD preload. Again, problem with stability, and again, I don't care about this for this project. And the way I implemented my project is using two layers. One is the socket abstraction layer, and the other one is the actual firewall. The socket abstraction layer allows me to abstract a native socket into standard open read close view. So I need to manage the sockets from cradle to death, and I need, of course, to maintain a map from this socket file descriptor to a user object that handles each socket. Each socket gets its own instance of a user object. And I don't want to interfere with the system operation, so there's no buffering at all that I'm allowed to introduce. And I signal to the user object important actions by using the constructor to signal a socket open, an on-read invocation which signals a socket read, and the destructor signals a socket close. I provide the user object with the socket file descriptor, so the user object can interact with the socket, and the user object signals back to me in the return value whether I should forcibly close the socket. So what do I need to hook? You can see that in Windows, I just need to hook 7 functions to cover the full functionality of the usual suspects. And same goes for Linux, tested in 64 bits. Again, nice array of web servers is covered by hooking 7 functions only. While implementing the socket abstraction layer, I learned a lot about the internals of web servers and sockets. Of course, especially in Linux, worker processes and forking must be supported. This is not fully functional yet in my library. I just run a single process instance of the web server for testing. Locking of the socket management table is also desired. So far, I haven't implemented it. Preserving the correct error state is mandatory. You can easily crash a system or make the system malfunction if you do not preserve error no last error and WSA last error. std out and std error are not always available, so write your own log file. For some bizarre reason, Squid on Linux doesn't like fclose, so I had to resort to using the direct I/O functions. Statistically linked executables with stripped symbols are a serious problem for my approach, so compiled Go products like Traffic and Credi are not supported at this time. Interestingly enough, the Linux receive implementation actually invokes the receive from syscall. This is a bit surprising. Accept or accept for are sometimes invoked with address being null. This is valid, but also surprising. And Node.js uses a library called uvlib, which invokes the syscalls directly. So I can't hook, there's no point in hooking the usual socket functions. I need to hook specifically the uv accept for function in this case in order to get the full functionality. On top of the socket abstraction layer, I implemented another class called the Request Smuggling Firewall that uses the socket abstraction layer to implement the Request Smuggling Firewall, surprisingly. And it enforces the strict RFC 2616 on the relevant parts of the HTTP request, like request line format, header name format, content length, transfer encoding, header end of line, chunk body format. It operates with the default deny policy. It only buffers a single partial line internally. It always sends the data immediately to the application, to the web server, but it buffers a partial single line, and so that there's never a full line with violation transmitted to the web server. So it stops immediately upon the first violation. And the violation can cause it to send a 400 response, as we'll see in a moment, and to terminate the connection. And let's see a demo. Okay, demo. So we run Squid with the RSFW library, and then we try we first load the target page to Squid's cache, as we usually do. Now we run the first variant. We can see that it fails with a 400 response. And if we load the target page again, this time, we can see that it's actually not poisoned. Now we run the second variant. If you remember, it should run for 30 seconds, but actually it just exited immediately. And same with the fifth variant. So, during my HTTP request smuggling research, I bumped into some interesting, promising, or suspicious anomalies in some HTTP devices, for which I can describe a matching behavior. So if I found something interesting in a web server, I can describe a matching behavior in a proxy server that leads to HTTP request smuggling. However, I could not find this matching behavior in my zoo of products so far. Just to illustrate, let's say we go back to 2005, and I notice a web server which takes the first header in a double content length request. A matching behavior would be then a proxy server that takes the last content length in such a request, but keeps both headers. But let's say that in my lab back then, I could only find proxy servers that either take the first header or reject the request. Then in 2005, this would have been a very interesting and relevant example. Naturally, in 2020, this isn't, there are probably no web server or proxy server that behave so naively, but you get the idea. So, carriage return in a header name is interpreted as a hyphen. So, just like I mentioned, one web server treats this content carriage return length as the header content length. I suspect this is due to a quick and dirty uppercasing using OR with OX20. So if you OR OX20 with a carriage return, you get a hyphen. The matching proxy behavior is to simply ignore this header and forward it as is. And the attack in this case would be having a web server expect a body, and using a GET request, the web server will immediately forward the request to the application without a body. And on the other hand, the matching proxy so the matching proxy will treat it as a zero-length body, and the web server expects a body of a certain length, and therefore web cache poisoning ensues. Unfortunately, for me, as an attacker, all proxy servers I have either rejected with a 400 response or modified their request. This may be fixed by the time this presentation is aired, so I urge you to get updates on through the white paper. So hopefully I'll be able to update and to name the relevant web server in the white paper. Signed content length. I'm talking about adding a plus sign in front of the value. Obviously, it's non-RFC behavior because content length only allows digits. Some proxy implementations use API like A2I that does accept a sign. The matching web server behavior is to simply ignore this header, and the attack is obvious. The web server has de facto content length 0, whereas the proxy server sees 1, 2, 3, 4. This doesn't work, of course, if the proxy normalizes the content length header before forwarding it to the web server. All the web servers I have either reject or honor this request as is. So no good here. And the vendor, I reported it to several proxy vendors. It was fixed by Squid, Abyss, and Go. Content length value with space. So I'm talking about content length 12 space 34. Again, it's non-RFC. Nginx ignores this header. What I want to find is a proxy that uses one of the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, or 3, 4, and forwards the request header as is. The attack is obvious. All the proxy servers I have either reject or remove this header. I reported this to Nginx, and they say they won't fix it because it doesn't look like a vulnerability in Nginx. The request in question cannot be passed through a compliant HTTP proxy with the header interpreted as a content length header, so they say. Finally, there's one web server that simply ignores transfer encoding, even in HTTP 1.1. Obviously, this is not an RFC compliant behavior. What I look for is a proxy server that prefers transfer encoding over content length, but does not modify the request. And the attack would be to send a request with both transfer encoding and content length, where the proxy would use the transfer encoding header and the web server would use the content length header. All the proxies I have normalize the request either per the content length header or per the transfer encoding header, so this becomes a non-relevant, so I cannot exploit it in my lab. To conclude, we see that HTTP request smuggling is still a thing in 2020 in common off-the-shelf software. Existing open source solutions are lacking. There is a more robust approach for defending against HTTP request smuggling, and it is feasible. I'm talking about implementing a lightweight solutions specifically tailored for HTTP request smuggling in path. It can be applied by vendors or third-party security software. And there are still some interesting challenges in this area. Thank you very much. Right. So thank you very much for attending my session. Right now I see there is one question, but what a question this is. The question is, let me read it for everyone. Are there good fuzzing frameworks for testing for HTTP request smuggling besides manual testing, e.g. through burp or zap? So, to the best of my knowledge, some web application scanners have HTTP request smuggling testing attacks incorporated in them. Having said that, I think that there are some obvious hurdles in automatically testing for HTTP request smuggling, as some of the people on the chat mentioned. So in essence, one needs to be very careful about the impact of the attack, which can be very tricky in the case of HTTP request smuggling, including long-lasting effect on the cache. At large, I think this attack is somewhat more difficult to control or to predict the outcome of the exact attack or the variant compared to other application vulnerabilities or application attacks. I think James Kettle in his last year's Black Hat presentation touched some of the issues about securely and safely testing for HTTP request smuggling, but obviously it's non-trivial. So the net answer, or the bottom line with respect to this question, at least from what I know, is that some automatic application scanners do test for it, but there are some inherent problems in automatic and large-scale testing that perhaps prevent large-scale and intensive fuzzing around HTTP request smuggling. Okay, and I see that there is now another question. Right. So, okay. I got an excellent question here. When you showed the poisoned page on the demo, it looked like an attacker injected it there. I missed the beginning. But the question says you can only use the HTTP request smuggling to access pages already on the web server, right? Not for an attacker to introduce new content. Absolutely, you're 100% correct. But think about it this way. An attacker can still say, on some sites there are attacker-controlled content like comments or blogs or personal areas in the website, which the attacker has a lot of control over. And also think about this. Let's say that there's hot news about some I don't know, COVID-19 vaccine being tested by company XYZ, and then you replace, quote unquote, or make this to make the URL be cached with the content about the same company having an earlier vaccine variant shown ineffective, and that can have impact on that company and on the share price of that company. And so what I'm saying is, even if the attacker cannot have his or her own page on the website so that the URL, the cached URL is cached together with the content from the attacker's controlled page, the attacker can still incur a lot of damage by having one URL caching the content from another page, which is not intended for that URL. So yes, but technically you're absolutely right. You can only do this attack with a page, with a poisoned page that is already on the website. Absolutely right. Actually, I don't see any further questions right now. Okay. All right. There's another question here, but I think that we can just... No, so there's a question here. Sorry, there's a question here about the variants I demonstrated the attack against, the testing against proxies or WAFs built in-house. No, the attacks were against a combination of two common off-the-shelf pieces of software. One is a Squid proxy and another one is Abyss X1 server. could HTTP poisoning work in tandem with a URL redirect attack to another site? I guess the answer to that is no, because the attacker, we are talking about HTTP requests that are generated by the attacker. If there's a redirect in the website, I don't think it affects the attack. The redirect works at the browser level, and we're talking here about HTTP level, so it's a bit more raw, if you get my meaning. How do you see the lightweight implementation of your suggested fixes with hooks on large-scale proxy networks like CDNs? Excellent questions. Obviously, CDNs are not going to incorporate my code. This was more like a wake-up call for vendors and security vendors to show them that HTTP request smuggling protection is possible. And I think the way to do it is by focusing on HTTP request smuggling and providing excellent security specifically against this attack, instead of trying a catch-all solution like Web Application Firewall, which has its problems and has its drawbacks. Now, I'm not saying this is not a useful product, but obviously it's more difficult to deploy than a point solution against HTTP request smuggling. Let's see, anything else? Okay. Where can you find the content of your test scripts? I shared the URL in the chat room early in my presentation. And it will be, of course, in a link in my white paper that will be published tonight. Okay. All right. No, I think we are done here, and you can contact me directly if you have additional questions. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure giving you this presentation in Black Hat and answering your questions. Thank you.